All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you good. Thank you.
Great. All right, well, I wanted to thank Karen for inviting me. I wanted to thank Brad Birch for applying for CCA points, and also Angela for reviewing my talk just to make sure we didn't contradict each other, and then all of you for being there and likely for your great questions. I love this photo. It was taken by a 14-year-old daughter of a local canola grower, and I put it on most of my extension talks. If you do have questions today, I hope you'll ask them. I leave a couple spots for questions during the presentation. But if you have questions afterwards, please always feel free to email me or to call me at the number shown on your screen. So a question for you is, why are there relatively few acres of canola in Montana compared to each of the Western provinces? The answer is likely that we grow a lot fewer bushels per acre, making it more challenging economically. And why do we grow fewer bushels per acre is because we have more heat at the time of seeding and less moisture. One thing you might be wondering is why I'm talking about, say, heat at the time of flowering, maturity date in a nutrient management talk. You likely know seeding date and variety and weather all affect the timing of flowering, but fertility does too. So hang on and I'll show you later in the talk today how it does that. So today I'm going to talk about general soil preferences of canola, talk about nutrient considerations for growing canola in rotation, talk about the 2021 drought and how it affects 2022 fertilizer considerations, and talk about soil fertility management using the right rate, source, timing, and placement of NPK and S, giving these really very high fertilizer prices. So first, canola really likes well-aerated, porous soils. It does okay with low to moderate salt content, better than some of our other crops like pulse crops. It does better under minimum tillage, also in highly diverse rotations. And generally does well in roughly a neutral pH. As probably most of you know, acidic soils are becoming more common in Montana, and at least what I've observed in Golden Triangle soils is canola is among the most sensitive to low pH conditions. This is a photo I took of canola growing in the greenhouse using a soil from Chouteau County that had a pH of around 4.7. You can see it's looking very poor and it likely produced no grain. So you've probably all heard about the 4 R's of fertilizer management. I like to talk about the 5 R's, with the first being the right rotation because it's so important for canola production, followed by rate, source, timing, and placement. So just a few general nutrient considerations for crop rotations that include canola. As you know, nitrogen can be provided by a legume. Phosphorus, as you may or may not know, is used in quite high levels by both canola and alfalfa. So you might need more phosphorus after a canola rotation or after an alfalfa rotation. Canola, as I'll show, needs a lot of potassium, but most of that potassium ends up in the residue, not in the seed. Canola needs a lot of sulfur. It's a good scavenger, so it can deplete sulfur for the following crop. It also can reduce copper and zinc levels by subsequent mycorrhizal crops. Canola is not mycorrhizal, that fungal attachment to the roots that help the crop get phosphorus and metal micronutrients. So how does canola do after a range of previous crops? This is work done in Mandan, North Dakota, that shows 4 different previous crop residues: cereals, pulses, canola, and then either sunflower or safflower. Canola grown after each of those is rated on a scale that starts at 1, where canola grown on canola, that yield is assigned to 1. Notice canola grown on sunflower, safflower did about the same. After cereals did about 9% better, and after pulses did about 16% better. So on to nutrient issues during and after drought. The after drought here is my optimistic side. So as you probably know, drought affects a number of different reasons why nutrient availability is different after drought. One is simply roots don't reach as deep. They're not transpiring in a lot of ways that nutrients like nitrate and sulfate and chloride move to the canola plant is through transpiration. If there's not transpiration, there's not nutrient movement. And fixation is really susceptible to drought conditions. Also, organic matter decomposition, of course, is going to be less during a drought, resulting in low nutrient availability from the soil, and nutrients simply don't move easily in a dry soil to reach the roots. So how might that affect this coming year's fertilizer needs, specifically for canola, but for any of your crops? Because we generally had lower yields in 2021, that means less nutrients were removed by harvest. You likely are seeing higher soil nitrate and maybe higher other nutrient levels. It will also depend on whether you were able to get a crop or whether maybe you salvaged, hayed your cereal. Turns out that grazed or salvaged hay removes about 3 times as much potassium as grain. So if you harvested that off, you might have less potassium than if you just remove the seed. I mentioned decomposition of residue. If, again, you hayed before the crop was completely mature, there's more time for those nutrients to get released through decomposition. Decomposition, again, is slower in dry soils, which we still have in most of the state. And then you might be saying, what residue with our major grasshopper problem this past year? And then phosphorus and potassium recycling really depends on fall precipitation. If you were fortunate enough to get some, likely phosphorus and potassium are getting released from residue. Otherwise, it's probably still tied up in the residue. So what do I recommend for nitrogen, both post-drought and during drought? Of course, I recommend sampling as late as you can or as late as your crop advisor can, because that's the best estimate of 2022 nitrate levels. You might want to lower your nitrogen rate if your fall to early spring was, say, average amount of precipitation, because likely if it was average, you simply didn't lose much of that nitrogen to either leaching or denitrification. Lower amounts of early nitrogen allow you some flexibility for next year's precipitation, meaning if you aim high this spring and Mother Nature doesn't deliver, then you've spent a lot of money that's not going into the crop. If you start low and have a way to apply nitrogen later in the year, that's likely the more conservative approach. Pulse nitrogen credits will likely be lower than usual after drought because we simply didn't grow a lot of residue from pulses, nor was there likely a lot of end fixation in most places in 2021. Moving on to sulfur. I found both in pulse studies and Grant Jackson has found in wheat studies that it appears sulfur is more needed in a moderate drought than either in moist conditions or in a severe drought. So in this study that he conducted back in the early 2000s, when the triangle was in a drought and then coming out of a drought, what he did was he applied different amounts of sulfur, and then he tracked wheat grain yield. In 2002, water was limiting, so there was no benefit of sulfur. 2003, as this area was coming out of the drought, there was a really nice sulfur response, almost 7 bushels per acre. More was grown with sulfur than without. 04 and 05 were becoming pretty moist. And again, no sulfur response. So why in a moderate drought? That might not make sense to you. Well, again, in a severe drought, water is going to limit. In a moderate drought, there's less mineralization of organic matter, and organic matter is one of the large sources of sulfur in Montana soils. Also, gypsum will become more available when there's some moisture to dissolve it. And then, of course, in wetter years, that sulfur probably gets mineralized, that sulfur gets dissolved and is available to crops. So more on sulfur for canola later. In dry years, especially with the high fertilizer costs we're seeing right now, it's really tempting to back off on fertilizer. I likely would. But the question is this the best choice? And of course, that's an economic decision, but I wanted to show you some yield data from Canada. So this is work done in Saskatchewan over 72 years, where they grouped the 24 driest years, 24 most average years, and then the 24 wettest years, and tracked grain yield for both with phosphorus and without phosphorus. As you might expect, in wet years, there was a pretty nice response to phosphorus. In normal years, there was also a pretty good response, but then kind of a surprise to me is even in the 24 driest years, there was also a response, and percentage-wise, probably a fairly large response. This is likely because phosphorus does increase drought tolerance. It helps roots grow. It helps increase what's called stomate control. So the plant doesn't just turn off its stomate and stop photosynthesizing altogether. There's better stomate control, and there's better what's called conductance of water through the roots. So a lot of advantages of phosphorus during drought. There's a number of non-fertilizer practices, agronomic practices that you can use to improve soil water, both for canola and other crops. So reduced tillage generally works better with canola. It traps snow, it reduces wind stress, reduces evaporation loss, reduces soil temperature, and increases water infiltration and storage, which then increases yield. This is another study done in Saskatchewan showing the effect of stubble height in inches on yield for wheat, chickpea, and canola. And notice that canola really has by quite a bit a larger benefit from leaving stubble height tall. Now, of course, if you have a lot of sawfly, you're probably not cutting your stubble very high. If you have animals, you're probably removing a fair amount of this stubble. But I'm just pointing out that increased stubble height can really dramatically increase canola yield. And then anything you can do to have some sort of residue on the surface, like recrop or planting covers, should help improve soil water content. Any questions so far? I'll just leave it on the slide for a little bit in case there's a burning question before I move on. Anything? Okay, I'm going to move on to tools to determine fertilizer rates and deficiencies. So, of course, you should always start with a realistic yield goal. How, for example, if you're a first-time canola producer, how would you find that yield goal? Well, you could use MSU's variety trial results. Instead of trying to write all this down, this talk will be on my webpage, which is shown at the end after today's presentation. Past yields, of course, generally indicate future performance. Having the ability for some sort of in-season end application, like say streamer bars, will allow you to go low this spring around planting and then add more nitrogen if the year turns out to be a good one. And then you're going to want to look up how much nitrogen is needed to produce a bushel of seed. And that would be simply for nitrogen, add up nitrate plus in-season organic matter decomposition, meaning if you have, say, higher than 3% organic matter, I usually say you can add about 15 pounds of nitrogen per acre for that additional organic matter. And then plus your fertilizer. This is a photo I took and put together to kind of give you a general flavor for how much fertilizer it takes to grow a bushel of canola seed. And these are 2-liter bottles. The black line is the total amount of each of these fertilizers in a mature plant. The red line is how much is removed by a bushel of seed. So the difference is really how much is left behind. Certain fertilizers like phosphorus, basically most of the fertilizer in the plant ends up in the seed. Potash, however, requires a lot of volume, a lot of weight to grow a bushel of seed, but very little of it ends up in the seed. And that's shown by this table down here that shows much more sulfur and potassium are needed by the plant than are removed in the seed, which is why there's quite a bit of potassium and sulfur left over after a canola crop. Phosphorus and nitrogen actually do a better job. The plant does a better job of getting phosphorus and nitrogen into the seed. The MSU fertilizer guideline for canola is 3.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, which falls essentially in about the middle of the range that the Canola Council of Canada recommends. More for those of you who haven't grown canola before, I wanted to show the difference between how much potash wheat needs compared to canola. And again, it's quite a bit more for canola, not what you want to be seeing right now with high fertilizer costs if you're putting canola in 2022. Maybe it is what you want to see if you had canola in 2021, because you're probably going to leave a lot of potassium behind. And then over here is ammonium sulfate. Canola needs a lot more ammonium sulfate than wheat. So again, not what you want to be seeing if you're growing canola this year, but again, you probably left a lot of sulfur behind if you grew it in 2021. So why do I recommend so strongly to soil test in the spring? It's based on a study that I and people at each of our research centers did several years ago that found that fall soil test nitrate can be very different than spring soil test nitrate. And why is that? Well, if you have a high nitrogen crop or a lot of residue or high organic matter, and that mineralizes, meaning decomposes, you can end up having a lot more nitrate in the spring than the fall, and therefore you over-fertilize. This is a year you do not want to be over-fertilizing. Or conversely, if you leave quite a bit of nitrogen behind on a shallow or coarse soil, or say like this year after a drought, and then we're fortunate enough to get a lot of precipitation over winter and early spring, we might have leaching losses or maybe even some nitrogen gas losses, in which case you're going to under-fertilize. One recommendation would just be to try both on a few fields and see if you do have big changes between fall and spring. Maybe this is not an issue on your farm. Once the season has begun, one of the things I strongly recommend doing is that you or your crop advisor scout for nutrient deficiencies. So for example, nitrogen shows up as yellow leaves, yellow lower leaves, sulfur, a little more yellow upper leaves. Potassium shows up as yellowing on the leaf borders, and phosphorus as purple leaves. There's a short period of time where we can still correct a nutrient deficiency with canola. So now I'd like to switch over to calculating fertilizer rates and what things I'd recommend you considering consider when fertilizer costs are high. As I pointed out earlier today, nitrogen rate adjustments become more important when costs are high. Again, I credit somewhere between 15 and 20 units per 1% above 2% organic matter. So if you have 3, 4, or 5%, you can back off your nitrogen rate by at least 15 units. After a legume rotation, you should be able to adjust your fertilizer down because of additional nitrogen provided by that legume. Nitrogen credits, I would say, are still more of an art than a science. I would like to make them more of a science, but I recommend, based mainly on work that Perry and I have done, that you back off by about 10 units. If you've grown, say, a pea or lentil or chickpea 1 to 2 times, you can back off more like 20 units if you've grown those 3 times or more. If you've grown cover crops, you can back off even more. And then after alfalfa, the range is pretty large, depending whether it's dryland alfalfa or irrigated alfalfa. I also see sometimes a bigger nitrogen bump the second year, and I think that's because of those big tap roots. So we're still trying to figure out nitrogen credits in Montana. So here I wanted to show 3 different scenarios for how you would calculate how much nitrogen to add if you were growing spring canola. My first scenario is canola after spring wheat, then after a grain pulse that's been grown once, meaning a pulse pea or lentil grown for grain, or canola grown after a legume cover crop grown one time. My yield goals were essentially based on the previous crop, a little bit lower for growing after cereal than after a pulse crop. And then the highest yield would be after a cover crop because it preserves more water. I multiply that yield goal by 3.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel to get these total nitrogen needs. I subtract off spring soil nitrogen, which again, I've estimated from some of our rotation studies where there's going to be less nitrogen after spring wheat and more after legume cover, and likely even more this year because the crop didn't use as much. My nitrogen credit, I apply a nitrogen credit based on the previous table. And what I find is that the fertilizer nitrogen amount that I would need would be somewhere around 40 units if I grew canola after spring wheat, 28 units if I grew it after a pulse, and probably about no nitrogen if I grew it after a cover crop. So fortunately, these aren't, really high, but again, it depended on a number of assumptions, with the really critical part being you can't know how much to add if you don't soil test. This is a graph of figures showing the effects of nitrogen on canola seed yield in bushels per acre for different nitrogen rates and different sulfur rates. So 4 sulfur rates, 0, 9, 18, and 27 pounds of sulfur per acre were added. And then 4 nitrogen rates, none, 45, 90, and 135. Notice this really surprising result. When more nitrogen was applied with no sulfur, the yield actually went down. So the crop probably used up water, used up sulfur, ran out of both later in the season, and simply the yield actually went down with more nitrogen. At 9 pounds of sulfur per acre, the yield went up with higher nitrogen, but actually went down at the highest rate. And we need about 18 pounds of sulfur per acre to actually have what I would call a more normal nitrogen response curve, where more nitrogen predictably produced more yield. So you don't want to be applying low amounts of sulfur with your canola. It's not going to use the nitrogen fertilizer that you've applied very efficiently at all. So a little more on sulfur for canola. There's not a good soil test for sulfur, and that's really unfortunate. But you can base your sulfur rate on field history. If you've seen certain sulfur deficiencies in parts of the field, you can do test strips with a sulfur fertilizer, and you can use tissue testing. I'd say in general, if you have less than 20 pounds of sulfur per acre to 2 foot of depth, sulfur is likely limiting, but I can't promise that it's actually limiting. Sometimes we find high levels of sulfur below 2 feet. I recommend somewhere between 18 to 20 pounds of sulfur per acre broadcast at seeding, especially if you think you have sulfur deficiency. As a rescue, which I'll point out later, has some risk to it, somewhere closer to about 0.5 pounds of sulfur per bushel of yield potential that can be added as ammonium sulfate, ammonium thiosulfate. There's different ways of getting sulfur onto your crop. Moving on to phosphorus. So phosphorus recommendations for canola are fairly high. Again, canola is a big phosphorus user. Here I show a table with Olsen phosphorus on the left, phosphorus rate on the right. As Olsen P goes up, the amount of phosphorus needed goes down. And then if you just want to maintain your phosphorus levels, you could apply somewhere around 0.9 pounds of P2O5 per bushel of expected yield, or maybe somewhere around 10 pounds per acre with the seed. For potassium, you could follow this table that shows as potassium levels increase in the soil, the potassium needed increases up to 250 parts per million, above which you could add a maintenance amount, or maybe, as I point out here, maybe none when costs are high. So the little teaser I said at the beginning, how can nutrients affect the time or the days to canola maturity, and therefore almost for sure affect yield? That's what this work shows here, where sulfur was applied at 4 different growth stages: seeding, rosette, bud, and then late bud to flower. Nitrogen was applied at 3 different rates: 0 N per acre, 100 pounds of N per acre, and then a really high rate that we wouldn't use in Montana, just to show how high nitrogen affects canola maturity. And then days to maturity are shown on the vertical axis. Notice that the 0 and the 300 rate actually caused higher days to maturity than the 100 rate. So a moderate rate of nitrogen seems to reduce the days to maturity, at least when sulfur is applied early. The other thing to notice is as sulfur is applied later and later, the days to maturity go up. So you really want to get your sulfur on either near the time of seeding or rosette stage, and not wait beyond bud stage or even to bud stage. And then, of course, starter phosphorus is important for an early start, as Angela pointed out, and excess N can slow maturity. Finally, sufficient sulfur is really needed before elongation for earlier maturity, and insufficient S seems to extend the flowering period. Any questions? I know there's a few people online. I'll also be watching the chat box here for a few seconds. Any questions whatsoever so far? All right, well, I'm going to move on to source. All right, so specifically for nitrogen, you know there's a whole bunch of different nitrogen sources out there. The most common would be urea, and then next most common would be 28 or 32 solution. But there's also a lot of specialty products. So things like NBPT, which is a urease inhibitor and reduces volatilization, Nserve and Instinct, which have nitrification inhibitors. There's combo products, there's slow release products. What I've done here is just shown how each of these products does have some potential loss compared to urea, where a number of these products like UAN, ammonium nitrate, calcium ammonium nitrate, generally will volatilize less, just like NBPT products will volatilize less than urea. Some of these products have the potential to leach less. The reason I have some question marks and the reason I put potential loss is there just simply hasn't been a lot of research on these products regarding volatilization or leaching. Rick Engel definitely found NBPT volatilizes less than urea, but that's about the only thing I can say definitely in Montana. How about sulfur source and timing to benefit seed yield? Here I have 3 different products listed: sulfate, elemental sulfur that's incorporated, and then rapid release elemental sulfur, which is just elemental sulfur ground to a much finer level. And then across the top, I have either applied 2 years previous to the canola, just the prior crop, the fall before, and then the spring or right at seeding. As you'd probably guess, makes me the happiest when sulfate is applied near the time of seeding. It's very mobile. You don't want to apply it way before it's needed. Elemental sulfur on the other end of the spectrum, because it takes a year to 2 years to maybe even 3 years to oxidize by microorganisms, you probably want to get that on maybe up to a couple years prior to canola production, whereas rapid release can likely be applied the fall before. Moving on to phosphorus source. It's quite a bit of discussion often between using granular products versus liquid products. I would say make sure you can calculate the dollars per pound of P2O5 because that's super important, and then also the ease of application. Seems overall they work about the same, so I really think it should come down to price and what way you have, say, to get liquids or granular fertilizer on your ground. Animal manure is an excellent source of phosphorus, potassium, and micros. Generally, it has a lot more P and K relative to N than plants need, and you do have to be aware of herbicide residue. On to timing and placement. This is a graph showing as canola plant growth progresses from early leaf stage all the way up to flowering, the percent of maximum uptake for 4 different nutrients, as well as just the dry matter production. So the red line here is how much dry matter is produced at each stage of growth. Notice the sulfur and the phosphorus gets taken up a little bit faster than the plant is actually growing. So you want to make sure you have phosphorus and sulfur in the ground before these really steep increases in biomass production that happen somewhere around stem elongation to early flower. Nitrogen and potassium are even more dramatic. Look how much faster a canola plant takes up nitrogen and potassium than it puts on biomass. And they all end up at 100% at 50% flowering. So that means, again, you need to get your nitrogen and your potassium on early, or you're probably going to have some reduced yield. But I still recommend backing off a little bit on your nitrogen and putting some more on kind of early to mid-season, again, if Mother Nature delivers some rain. How about placement? So nitrogen is typically broadcast in Montana. Some people put it, say, with the seed or mid-row band it down a little bit. Some put it even deeper. This is a study done in Western Canada by a number of researchers at a number of sites comparing urea, NBPT, that urease inhibitor, and Super U, which is a urease inhibitor combined with a nitrification inhibitor. And then they track canola seed yield in bushels per acre. The much higher yields from these enhanced efficiency products that have NBPT than on broadcast tells me that in these studies, a significant amount of urea volatilized. And so it might actually be a benefit to use these enhanced efficiency products if you can only broadcast your urea. Notice that when they applied those products a little bit deeper, 1/4 inch to 1.5 inches deep, the curves didn't really change all that much. We still saw a pretty big yield improvement by using the specialty products over broadcast. The products had to be applied at least 2 inches deep to have no effect of product, implying volatilization didn't matter. So again, this is probably frustrating to you because for years you've heard me and other researchers say, just put your urea below the ground and it won't volatilize. Well, you have to put it more than an inch or so below the ground to really stop volatilization. These numbers were also the depth prior to packing, not post-packing. And I would recommend an early spring broadcast with incorporation if you are tilling. If your seeder can't place nitrogen deep, do consider a product with NBPT. And finally, the liquid products like 28 and 32 solution are probably better put below the ground than surface banded, again, if your goal is to decrease volatilization. And finally, placement of phosphorus and potassium. It's really important that phosphorus is close to the root zone, as Angela mentioned. If you have to put more than maybe about 10 to 15 units on with the seed in a seed row, you might consider maybe side banding or maybe building with a prior crop because, again, as Angela mentioned, canola is quite sensitive to fertilizer salt. I would recommend broadcasting your potassium unless you simply don't have to put maybe any phosphorus down with the seed, just because it's a little bit saltier than phosphorus and it moves a little bit easier than phosphorus does. Micronutrients are a little more challenging. There's not great soil tests. Again, we don't have a ton of confidence with our soil tests in Montana. There just simply hasn't been enough research. I would say in general, micro deficiencies are the exception, not the rule. Cool and wet conditions often can cause a deficiency, and then the plant outgrows it as the weather warms up. Too much of some micronutrients, especially boron, can hurt yield more than not enough. So be careful, especially with boron. And the main issue with micros is when you only need them at, say, 1/2 pound per acre, how do you evenly distribute them? Which is why I recommend foliar applications of micronutrients. So to sum up, I really recommend using soil tests, which are more important after a drought and more important when fertilizer costs are high. Ensure that nutrients are available before stem elongation. Adjust N in season to reflect the growing season precipitation. You definitely need adequate S to ensure nitrogen response, and you need that sulfur early to not delay maturity. You need to really think about timing and placement for a given source, not independent of that source. And do consider a pulse crop before growing canola. If you want more information on soil nutrient management for canola, you might turn to our soil nutrient management guide for canola that we wrote in 2016. You can find it at my website under Extension Publications. We also have these shorter versions called Soil Scoops, which are just 2 pages, 1 page front and back, and really get to the point. or you can turn to the Canola Council of Canada Encyclopedia or SDSU's online fertilizer damage tools, which tells you for a certain row spacing and a certain fertilizer and a certain crop, how much seed place fertilizer you can apply. And with that, do you have any questions? No questions? Or maybe I can't hear you guys.
Okay. If you can hear me now, do you have any
I can.
recommendations of how to try to get that nitrogen below that 2 to 4 inches? Is that before planting, or do you want to try to do that after the seed's up and growing?
Oh, when to put that nitrogen down?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, so some planters can put that down at the time of seeding. If you don't have a way to do that, I would probably say, yeah, either before, if you have confidence that you can drive maybe with GPS guidance so that your seed doesn't end up too close to your fertilizer band. But basically, any way you can get nitrogen at least 2 inches below the ground should stop volatilization.
Any other questions? Any questions on the internet? Okay. Thank you, Clain.
All right. Thank you, guys. If you have any questions after the
Excuse me,
fact,
Bob,
let me
did you have a
know.
question? Hold on, one more question.
Just quickly, Clain, you mentioned in-season applications of N. I'm assuming stream barred 28% or something like that. I was wondering what your thoughts would be on waiting till early pod and applying 25 to 30 pounds of liquid urea, foliar applied, not streamed.
I can't hear this question. I don't know if that mic's not turned up as loud. I'm sorry. We're also having a little bit of a wind event here, and I've got a lot of whistling in my windows.
Can you hear me now, Clain?
I can.
Yes, I was wondering, you had referenced the idea of in-season applications of N and cutting back on the front end. I was wondering what your thoughts would be regarding application at early pod of liquid urea, 25 to 30 pounds. I guess the Europeans are having quite a bit of success doing that with the high cost of fertilizer N right now. Perhaps, no one has a crystal ball, but perhaps by early pod, N prices may be down. And secondly, we may just gain greater nitrogen use efficiency all around.
Yeah, good question. I haven't seen data for nitrogen applied that late. My gut feel is it's could be too late to produce seed. I understand the urge to wait and hope prices come down, but I think based on at least what I showed, applying too little N up front can delay maturity and can hurt yield. And so I haven't seen that European research, but I would try to get my nitrogen on a bit earlier than that, even a second application. Thank you for the question, though.
Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, I have one. How you doing, Clain? Often we have to do our soil tests in the fall. It's just practically the only way we can do it. what I'd like, first of all, is there a study that shows the different times of a soil test taken during the year and how it increases or, how it changes over time? And something I could look at. And second is how do you do a rule of thumb? I know that's extremely difficult, but we have to do fall soil testing. It's just impractical for it to do it any other way.
Right. Yeah, the main study I have, we only sampled 3 times a year. I mean, it would be nice to have more, but what we did was August for kind of the winter wheat, kind of, a fairly typical time for winter wheat guys to be sampling. Then we did a mid-November and an early April. So what we found was that the August was generally quite a bit lower than April, but there were some sites where nitrogen went way down, like up to 60 units, and other sites where it went way up, like by 60 units. By waiting till mid-November, the differences really shrunk. So the mid-November did quite a bit better, as you can envision, at estimating growing season nitrate. But I understand what you're saying. You can't get it all done in spring, even if Clain says you should. You only have certain number of spreaders, and it's just not practical. It gives farmers a chance to buy fertilizer price over winter, at a decent price. So I understand what you're saying. Does that answer your question, though?
Yes.